When Sanofi fired their CEO, Chris Viehbacher, last year, Forbes magazine and other commentators called it a huge mistake. I tried to be less judgmental and more reflective. After all, we'll never really know if it was or it wasn't a mistake. But there are lessons here about a company's culture and its ability to evolve. So allow me to give you a little background to the theory before we turn into the practical implications for companies hoping to adapt to the future. Because we know far more about biological evolution than we do about economic and industry evolution, drawing analogies from the former to the latter is very helpful. So, for example, most biological genomes are very stable. In humans, for example, the normal non-cancer rate is only about 0.35 mutations per generation. And there are obvious advantages to such genome stability, because if our offspring were very different from us, then we might expect a lot of deleterious mutations and a high rate of child mortality. Of course, we might evolve faster, but at a higher cost. Nature, in its wisdom, seems to have settled on an appropriate balance between stability and evolution. Now, as I've discussed recently, a firm's equivalent of its genes are its organisational routines. And by this I mean its multitude of sub-processes for doing things, from paying bills to discovering drugs to staying legal. As anyone who has worked in a big company knows, this complex web of routines is as necessary as it is stable. If we had to think from first principles whenever we wanted to do anything, we'd never get anything done. And if each routine was a little different every time, we'd spend so much time finding our way through the process that we'd be effectively paralysed. When new situations arise, we can and we do adapt routines, but this is relatively rare. There's no data on this, but if you told me that a pharma company's genome of routines was as stable as a human's exome, I'd believe you. This raises questions of what keeps the company genome so stable. Given that there are a multitude of opportunities for routines to change, deliberately and otherwise, how come they don't change very much? In my research into why and how life science companies are evolving, the prime candidate for this genome stability mechanism seems to be organisational culture. Years ago, the great Edgar Schein identified that routines are the artefacts of organisational culture. He realised that cultural artefacts, which are usually visible and tangible, are simply an expression of what the organisation perceives as valuable. So, for example, if you have a rigid hierarchical process for approving business plans, that means that the organisation values seniority and experience and places less value on flexibility. In Schein's model, cultural values flow from the organisation's fundamental assumptions about the best way to do business in the market environment. These assumptions are almost always implicit and are often ancient, having their roots in the formation of the company. Altogether, cultural artefacts, values and assumptions permeate the whole company, and due to their invisibility and their interconnectedness, they are very hard to change. In the wise words of Peter Drucker, organisational culture is persistent and pervasive. So culture, which is based on fundamental assumptions about the best way to do business, embeds ways of doing things and ensures the stability of the corporate DNA in subtle and powerful ways. And there's the rub. When the market changes and routines need to change too, culture hinders adoption. Even when companies see the need to adapt and do things like appointing a new CEO with new ideas, they are often hindered by the persistent and pervasive culture. In practice, fresh thinking new employees are either tamed by the culture, and the jargon calls this enculturation, or the culture spits them out quite quickly. When Mr. Viehbacher left Sanofi, they talked about issues of style, which is always an indicator of culture clash. So what's the practical application of this? Well, when markets change and firms need to change with it, then doing a gene transplant using a senior executive like a viral vector may seem like a great idea. But Schein's work tells us that it is more likely to result in costly, time-consuming rejection. Transplants only really work if the rest of the leadership actively engage in suppressing or adapting the cultural immune system that will otherwise reject the genes. In practice, this means thinking carefully about what deep, hidden assumptions need to change, and then re-engineering the values and artifacts that flow from them. As in biology, this doesn't mean throwing out the cultural baby with the bathwater, because stability remains valuable. But it does mean that getting the balance right between mutation on the one hand and stability on the other. And this is very tricky. It's a balancing act, but that's what the board is paid for.